The ACASIS TBU401E is an external M.2 enclosure that fully supports both Thunderbolt and USB 4.0. With an all-metal construction, the TBU401E looks better than half the offerings on the market. As a metal enclosure, especially one that is designed and built very well, it will act as a passive heatsink for the SSD housed inside. However, looks can be deceiving, and since everyone is making an SSD enclosure these days, we shall see just how good the ACASIS TBU401E truly is. The ACASIS TBU401E is a metal-made M.2 SSD enclosure that is available for no less than $145 at the time of this review. However, if you go on the ACASIS website, you can get the enclosure at a discounted price of $120. To put this price into perspective, the sub-brand EC-SNV USB-C is priced at around $30. A massive gap between these two enclosures, and both are offering more or less the same features: an all-metal construction, a toolless installation and portability, but the performance will be different. The packaging is quite good. It's a cardboard box with a foam insert on the inside, and that's pretty much it. In terms of the accessories, you get everything you need to use the enclosure: a user manual, a USB Type-C cable that is Thunderbolt compatible, 2 rubber pads to hold the SSD in place, and 2 thermal pads, one with a thickness of 1 mm and the other with a thickness of 0.5 mm. The design of the ACASIS TBU401E is good. It's a well-built piece of metal if you don't look at it closely. The surface of the enclosure has a matte finish with a flake paint, which is common with these enclosures, especially those made from solid metal. The sides of the enclosure have these fins carved into the metal surface. This will help somewhat with the cooling of the SSD housed inside, as the enclosure will act as a massive heatsink. In terms of the ports, there is only one present on this enclosure. It's this Thunderbolt USB Type-C port that acts as the input and output port. Next to it, there is a small hole. That is where the single blue activity LED will shine through. The TBU401E enclosure has a toolless design for both the opening and closing of the enclosure and the installation of the M.2 SSD. To open this enclosure, you simply pull on the tab on the side that has the markings and the top plate will come out. Inside the enclosure, we have a PCB that is attached to the bottom metal casing with 4 Phillips screws. The controller used on this enclosure is the Realtek RTL9210B. This is what adapts the M.2 socket to the USB Type-C connector. For the Thunderbolt functionality, the enclosure is using an Intel JHL7540 controller, a model that has been widely used on Thunderbolt-enabled enclosures and adapters. Finally, we have an ASMedia ASM1480 chip. This is a 16 to 8 channel multiplexer that is responsible for switching the signal between the outputs of the enclosure. The installation of an SSD inside the TBU401E is easy and can be done without any tools. You simply angle the SSD and insert it into the M.2 socket, and then you stop yourself as you forgot one thing. You need to place one of these rubber pads on the back of the M.2 SSD. With this little thing secured on the SSD, you push on it and on the SSD up until the point the rubber insert snaps into the PCB of the enclosure, thus holding the SSD attached. After this, you would reinstall the top metal plate of the enclosure and you would be done. However, there is a problem. The 2 included thermal pads that are supposed to make the contact between the metal casing of the enclosure and the M.2 SSD are not thick enough. This means that the SSD will not get passively cooled by the casing, but rather by the thermal pads alone. I would recommend you to buy a generic 2mm thermal pad for this enclosure and your SSD. However, I will not be testing the enclosure in terms of the cooling, as using any other thermal pad will make the test invalid. Expensive thermal pads will get a lower temperature, cheaper pads will get a higher temperature, and so on. The SSD used to test the enclosure is the Silicon Power P34A80 1TB, a good M.2 SSD that is not too expensive and should be easy to find. When installed on the motherboard, this SSD will deliver upwards of 3500 MB per second for the reading speeds and upwards of 3000 MB per second for the writing speed. However, with the SSD installed inside the ACASIS TBU401E, the speed hovered at around 2700 MB per second for the reads and 2400 MB per second for the writes. Not a bad performance, especially when compared to the speed of the SSD when it's installed on a motherboard and thus having full access to the system. From a performance standpoint, the ACASIS TBU401E is a good SSD enclosure, especially when paired with a high-end M.2 SSD. However, the thermal pads included are not useful at all, and it's unfortunate to see this type of mistake on a product that is not exactly cheap, not even at the discounted price of $120 US. And no, stacking thermal pads is not something that I would do personally. If you need an M.2 SSD enclosure that is capable of good speeds and is compatible with both Thunderbolt and USB Type-C, then the ACASIS TBU401E can be a good choice for you. If you are willing to buy some thicker thermal pads on your own, and you can find it closer to the $100 price mark, which is better suited for such an enclosure. The build quality is great. This enclosure is made from solid metal, and when looking at the PCB inside, there are good quality components used, and the soldering quality is great. The only thing remaining is for you to decide if spending this amount of money on an M.2 enclosure is the right thing for you. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and also if you want to support me in a direct way, then in the description below you will find the links for both the Patreon and the subscriber star pages of this channel.